Good morning. My name is Heinrich Schliemann. I was the poor son of a poor father. I had very little formal education in South Germany. Had to leave school at an early age, where I was apprenticed to be a grocer. One thing my father did do, though, he taught me to read and to appreciate books. At an early age, I found a copy of Homer's The Iliad, the epic story of the siege of Troy. Now, everybody knew about Troy at that time. Told me it was a myth, that it never happened. It was a story. And we knew that Homer had written it down at least 400 or 500 years after the events he describes. And everybody thought, whilst it was this great tale, this great swashbuckling tale of heroes and gods, it could never have happened. But you know, from a very early age, I believed that the tale of Troy was true. When I read those lines in the Iliad, I thought, this is memory. People have recounted this, handed it down from father to son for generations, until Homer finally wrote down the tale. And it became my life's object, strange as everybody thought, to prove that Troy was real. Now, I wasn't going to get far as a grocer's apprentice, but I did find I had a talent for business. I began to buy and sell. I moved to the Netherlands, and I bought and I sold. I sold military supplies during the Crimean War. I bought and sold salt. I bought and sold every commodity you could imagine, and by the time I was 40, I was a millionaire, quite a few times over. And I realized that I now could live that dream which I had always had. I sold my business for a huge amount of money and effectively retired from commerce. And I decided that I would put my fortune to great use. I would put my fortune to use by going to where I believed Troy to be and conducting an archaeological dig. Now, archaeology was all pretty new at that time. So I wasn't just being a pioneer of history, I was a pioneer of the science of archaeology. But what did happen at Troy? Why was I so obsessed? Well, Homer tells us. Now, his book covers only one small part of what was a 10-year war. It's a period of a few weeks. Starts with a dispute between the hero Achilles and the leader of the Greek forces, the great king Agamemnon. How it came about was that a son of Troy, of this proud city in what is now Turkey, stole away the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, Helen of Troy, the most beautiful and probably the most feckless woman in the world. She left her husband, who was devastated, and who appealed to his brother, the High King Agamemnon, for justice, for revenge, for the return of his wife. Now it happened, this rather suited Agamemnon, because the relationship between Mycenae, his great kingdom, and Troy were pretty strained, and there was already a trade and naval war going on. So Agamemnon used this cause to unite all the Greek city-states, and he brought all the great champions, all the great heroes and warriors from Greece together in a vast army that would sail across the Aegean and take the city of Troy. This was the biggest military undertaking in history. The nearest in the 20th century would be the D-Day operation in 1944. It's on that kind of scale. And all the great heroes, Ajax, the young Achilles, Odysseus, Nestor, all of them, Diomedes, Menelaus of course, all joined with Agamemnon to fight in his great crusade. And so it was the fleet sailed, but the omens were bad. Agamemnon was so ruthless he was prepared to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia as an offering to the gods to buy their support for this great venture. Such was his ruthless determination. And then the Greeks landed on the Trojan shore and looked and saw this great, huge city with its ancient king Priam and its great champion Hector standing on the walls. Trojans were not happy simply to stand behind their walls, however. They came out and fought. Day after day the armies fought upon the plain of Troy, and the man who led the Greeks, this warrior, this invulnerable hero Achilles, was the greatest champion on the plain of Troy. Achilles' mother had dipped him in the river Styx as a child, the idea being that he would become invulnerable. And so he was, except, of course, for his heel, which is how she held him. And so we get the expression, of course, Achilles' heel. Then Achilles made a raid on one of Troy's allies. He's brought back as booty 2 young female slaves, cousins, Chrysis and Briseis. One he gave to Agamemnon, the other, Briseis, he kept himself. And indeed, he fell in love with her. Agamemnon, however, had to send Chrysis back because she was the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Apollo sent a plague to scourge the Greeks in revenge for the insult to his priest. Bowing to the majority, Agamemnon, with bad grace, returned the girl, but insisted that Achilles, his subordinate, give up the girl Briseis. Now Achilles, who was prone to sulking, I have to say, threw a huge fit at this. He had no choice but to surrender the girl. On the other hand, he effectively went on strike. He withdrew his labour and said, right, that's it. You want your war, enjoy it. Agamemnon thought he could fight and win without Achilles, but he was wrong. He was as bad a general as he was a politician. And the Trojans began to gain the upper hand, led by the great hero Hector, who drove the Greeks all the way back to their ships and began to set the ships on fire. Now, of course, without the ships, the Greeks were lost. Achilles' friend and possibly lover, Patroclus, begged the hero to let him, as his subordinate, lead the Myrmidons, Achilles' crack troops, into battle. And Achilles agreed, not wanting to see his fellow Greeks defeated, and lent Patroclus his armour. So Patroclus went out into the fight, fighting with a bronze sword such as this. For in the Bronze Age, this is a leaf-shaped, double-edged blade, really intended more for the stab than for the slash. And with weapons like this and their great figure-of-8 shields, the heroes of Troy fought. Patroclus seemed to be unstoppable. Everyone thought he was Achilles. He killed Hector's cousin, Sarpedon, but then came up against the champion himself and was in turn killed. Only when Hector stripped the corpse of his victim did he realize he had not killed Achilles. Achilles was distraught at the loss of his friend, inconsolable, and he determined upon revenge. He led his men back into the fight and drove the Trojans all the way back to the wall, where he summoned Hector to meet him as champions in single combat. Now Hector, fearful as he was of Achilles' prowess, could not refuse. He had to go out. His own legend demanded that he go out on the plain of Troy and face him, spear to spear, for the spears were still the main weapon. And these two men danced around like a balletic competition, not the hack and thwack you see in movies, until Achilles, sensing his advantage, threw his spear and pierced Hector through the neck and killed him, dragging the corpse around the walls of Troy until finally King Priam was able to ransom the body. That wasn't the end of the war, though. Achilles himself was killed by a poison arrow which Paris, who had stolen Helen in the first place and caused the whole mess, shot into his exposed ankle. Eventually it seemed as though the Greeks could not hope to win. The walls of Troy were proof against any attack. But then the king of Ithaca, wily Odysseus came up with a cunning plan. This is very cunning indeed. He caused the Greeks to build upon the shore a huge timber horse, a horse dedicated to the goddess Athena, which it seems the Greeks were leaving as a peace offering. For the whole of the Greeks' army then embarked upon their ships and sailed away. Now, the Trojans were meant to think that the Greeks had sailed far away back to Greece, but in fact they only sailed under the lee of a nearby island, leaving a spy on the shore, a deserter effectively, to convince the Trojans that this horse was an offering. Now, yes, the horse was an offering to Athena, but not to the Trojans, for concealed in the hollow belly of the animal was Odysseus himself and 18 chosen men. And as the Trojans, in their joyful naivety, dragged the great horse within the walls and set about feasting and drinking, imagine that they were delivered from the curse of the siege. That night, dark, Odysseus and his men slipped out of the belly of the horse, slit the throats of the guards, opened the great gates, and the Greeks, returned of course to the shore, swarmed into the city of Troy and gave it over to the sack. The whole of Troy was levelled and razed. The survivors, dazed women and children, became slaves of the Greek heroes, although many of them, like Agamemnon, came home to a rather unfortunate welcome. It took Odysseus, cunning as he was, 10 years to reach his island kingdom of Ithaca. And then, here was I. I spoke to an Englishman who researched the whole likelihood of Troy being the mound of Hisarlik, and I was convinced he was right. This great mound or tell, as they were called, I knew would contain the traces of perhaps a dozen levels of Troy, for the site had been lived in for well over 3,000 years. And so I began to dig. The area was owned and controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and as always with Turkey, one had to disburse a certain amount of cash in order to get the necessary permits. I dug and I dug. Bit by bit, I pared away the levels of Troy. There were many levels. But I was convinced the level I called level 7B, it was the original Troy of Hector and Achilles. I was convinced of this because it seemed to fit the time well, and I dated the site to about 1250 BC. But also I found that that level of Troy had not been reduced by an earthquake. It had been systematically leveled and destroyed, not by a natural occurrence, but by the hand of man, a deliberate and prolonged destruction. That had to be the work of Agamemnon's Greeks. By this time, in the 1870s, I was in my 60s. But I was as yet unmarried. And, practical as ever, I interviewed a list of young women to find a suitable bride. One young woman, the daughter of a leading citizen of Greece, Sophia, became my wife, and a man could not have made a better choice. For, in the remains of what I knew to be that level of Troy, I found a wondrous diadem and jewels, which I thought must surely have belonged to Helen of Troy. And I adorned my beautiful young wife with these jewels, so that, nearly 3,000 years after they had last been worn, the jewels of Helen of Troy were once more adorning a beautiful woman, and the world would know, for now and evermore, that the tale of Troy was true, and that I, Heinrich Schliemann, was the man who had brought it back to life. Now, just to finish, one of the Trojans' allies were the Amazons. Now, these Amazons were a race of pretty fearsome warrior women, said to come from distant Scythia, and who were allied to Troy. Now, Penthesilea, who was the queen of the Amazons, fought a famous duel with Achilles, and she was a strong and fit young woman. Achilles didn't really want to kill her, but he did. And even as she was dying, he almost fell in love with her. And of course, she was an exponent of the spear being one of the principal weapons of the time. A deadly weapon in the right hands, and of course, she outreached the sword quite significantly. As you can see, but of course what a swordsman would have to do is to get inside the guard and then lunge and kill her. And so was fought the Trojan War.